As I just said to Law, this is a really good session. Simplest thing is not pricing. I think you could get them why.
Well, you know, I kind of think that it's been less depressing than it could have been. So we've done all that, but I agree with you. That that's the world we live in. And you can throw in an angry question after Andy's talk, probably.
I've got to remember who I'm here representing, so I can't necessarily always say what I think, even if I agree completely with it.
Oh, what a historically thing to say. I should say I'm speaking live into the mic, so that was a joke. Right then, shall we start, Andy?
Happy with it? Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Thank you all for returning for the graveyard shift of TAG 2016. We'll be finishing up by about 4:30, so hopefully most of you will be able to stay until the end. We've added Sue Greeny's paper from the middle session to the back of what we've got this afternoon. First up, though, is Andy Brockman, who is billed as a freelance archaeologist and editor of The Pipeline. Speaking on news is what somebody once suppressed, everything else is advertising. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. And thanks for accepting the paper this afternoon, to everyone who's organised the conference today. First of all, I must apologise for missing the session this morning, which looked great, and the papers looked fascinating, and so I had a call at home, which meant I had to miss the half of the session, so I apologise for that. Anyway, I am probably going to be slightly more discursive this afternoon than with a normal academic paper, because possibly some of the ideas that I'm going to throw out to you really for your response, it's more in terms of a provocation perhaps than a closely argued paper, but we'll see where we go. I wanted to start with this quote from Katherine Graham. Katherine Graham was the publisher of the Washington Post at the time of Watergate, and probably one of the high watermarks of investigative journalism worldwide, in that it led to the resignation of an American president. We wonder if that's going to happen again in the future. At the height of at the time, she was the owner and publisher of the Washington Post, and defined the journalism that she wanted as that. And as archaeologists, a lot of what we do, a lot of our communication actually does fall into the advertising category. We're telling people what we do, how we've done it, why it's a great thing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's exactly how it should be. And we do that in various ways, increasingly with our own publications and the control of our own publications, but also through the mainstream media, through the traditional, what's now called the dead tree media, broadcasters and so on. And it's actually the lifeblood of a lot of archaeology. Anyone who's ever made a funding application will be aware of that. You have to be able to show chapter and verse about cause and effect and added value and all whatever the jargon words happen to be at the time. And I just mention here a sort of apocryphal story. It's not apocryphal because I was actually told it by somebody who worked there at the time. But a few years back, somebody took over one of our major museums, and allegedly sort of first week on the job called in the head of the PR department and said, basically, I want a story in the national press once a week. In other words, it was good for them and good for the museum concerned that profile was maintained, so that when it came to arguing with government and local government about funding, there were demonstrable benefits there in the public domain. In the worst cases, it's advertorial. What Nick Davis from The Guardian called journalism, the constant recycling of press releases, pretending it's original work. That's not what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. What I'm talking about this afternoon is it's Katherine Graham's investigative side of the work. And what I want to do is highlight really a couple of stories. The Pipeline, which is the website that I founded a few years back in consultation with various colleagues, with the idea of treating archaeology not as reportage. We don't report people's sites and press releases and so on. What we do is generate our own content, investigating issues that we think are important in terms both to archaeologists, our little information silo, but also to in the wider public interest. And I think, again, I was following the Twitter stream this morning and talking and seeing the responses in terms of what's public, what's private, public versus private funding and so on. I think this plays directly into that area. So what I'm talking about is in many cases is this. George Orwell, great writer, great journalist, and that particular quotation comes from an unpublished preface to Animal Farm, which he wrote in 1943-44. It wasn't published because at the time he was on the wrong side of the argument in terms of World War II and Britain's relationship with Russia, and particularly the British left's view of the relationship with Soviet Russia, and particularly Joseph Stalin. Remember, Orwell had gone on the run in Spain when the anarchist group that he belonged to became an unorganisation under the influence of the KGB, or NKVD as it then was, who was supporting the Republican government. So he had a pretty jaundiced view of Stalinist communism. And that's the context of that quote, but I think it stands as a general quote in terms of talking about the freedom of the press. I think one of the reasons that we set the pipeline up and it was necessary was observing a trend, and I think it's exemplified by those of you who might remember the sale of the Riesco porcelain from Croydon Museum, the sale of the statue of Sekemka from Northampton Museum for £15.5 million, which was last seen heading to the USA to an anonymous buyer, having been sold from a public museum. And also the ongoing attempts by colleagues, including and particularly the JNAPC, Joint Nautical Archaeology Policy Committee, to prevent Odyssey Marine Exploration. Again, those of you that aren't aware, that it's a Florida-based commercial treasure hunting company, effectively, but who claims to have located HMS Victory 1744 in the English Channel and published a contract which they reached with a UK charity, which would allow them to commercially exploit some of the material from the wreck, which actually was sovereign British government property at the time. It's a long and complicated story, I won't go into it now, but it's looking at stories like that, which is where our interest came from, and the fact that the agencies that we would expect probably to act as the checks and balances on behalf of us, the public, and I'm talking here about the various agencies like Historic England and its various counterparts in the devolved administrations, National Trust, Museums Association and so on. In many of these cases, for reasons which we can discuss, didn't appear to be stepping up to the plate when things that might be defined as iffy were going ahead. And with situations like the sale of Sekemka, which was undertaken by a local authority, particularly driven by the head of that local authority, the baton there was picked up by a group of local activists who had no experience in campaigning at all before it started. They were mostly members of local learned societies and museum professionals, but who hadn't expected to be having to deal with a situation like this, a multi-million-dollar object being deliberately sold off by the local authority that was meant to be guarding it on behalf of the community. Those organisations often desperately need professional expertise of all kinds, legal, campaigning, you name it, because and any of you that have ever been involved in any campaigning will know if you're on the wrong side of the argument in terms of resourcing, you're Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill. When pushing down is the full weight of government and local government and commercial interests and the legal resources that they can pull on to completely outgun you if you're not careful. So we started looking at stories where we felt that we could make a difference. And the first one I'd like to draw your attention to particularly is the story of HMS Queen Mary. HMS Queen Mary was a British battle cruiser. She blew up at the Battle of Jutland with the loss of over 1,200 lives. And she's Crown property. She's what's called a sovereign immune warship. Nobody should interfere with her without the express written permission of the UK government. Except that over the years, Queen Mary, as an exemplar, but also virtually, I think 2/3 at least of the other Jutland wrecks, and many, many others, have been either sold off or systematically looted, or both. This is important because certainly in the we're talking about public archaeology, the public regards these as war graves, although there's no such thing as a war grave at sea. But they are protected by sovereign immunity, and they're also protected from exploitation by UK nationals by the Protection of Military Remains Act. A couple of years ago, I was working with some colleagues on this story, and they located a source from the salvage industry who effectively acted as a whistleblower and gave us the evidence to show that a Dutch company called Friendship Offshore had been systematically destroying the wreck of the Queen Mary and other ships, but specifically we looked at the Queen Mary, and what they're looking for is the non-ferrous metal. It's boiler room condensers, boiler room plant, copper, brass, things that fetch a premium in the international money, in the international metals exchanges. And at the time this was going on in 2009, 2010, there were spikes in the metals trade. It was when the Chinese economy was booming and they were building like it was going out of fashion. This is the kind of forensic archaeological evidence that we were looking at to prove the case. This is a crewman of from the Friendship Offshore holding the metal monogram, decorative monogram that was on the end of a barrel Tompion, is it Tompion? Tompion, thank you. I always get it wrong. Tompion, which is the decorative stopper that sits in the ship's main armament when she's in port. The point about that and why it was so forensically important is that it undoubtedly belongs to the Queen Mary, and there was only ever one HMS Queen Mary in the Royal Navy's inventory. It had to have been that ship that blew up at Jutland. That man should not have been holding it. That is British government property that his company have illicitly salvaged, being nice about it. So what do we do about this? Now, when we first came across this and came across this proof, we played by the rules. We took it to the Ministry of Defence, to Ministry of Defence Police, CC, the various agencies like the Marine Management Organisation, Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and so on. And we waited to see what they'd do. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and nothing happened. So this spring, when we came to, when it came to the 100th anniversary of Jutland, we made this decision that we'd go public with the story, which is why it ended up being published in Pipeline a week before the Jutland anniversary. The story, that was very deliberate. I make no bones about it. It's an editorial decision. We put it out there at the most effective time you possibly could, because we wanted, if you remember, the MOD of the government was grandstanding the Jutland anniversary, big international event saying how important it was to remember our war dead and so on, and yet they've been standing by for years, as we now know, watching this happen, and actually upsetting a lot of the families of the veterans who remember the veterans, but particularly those who lost family members with that ship on the 31st of May 1916, who are still remembered in families today. They're still very much a part of the family experience. So that's that. In the end, the story was picked up by amongst others, the Mail, the Sun, but also just last night it was picked up in a blog entry in The Guardian, and particularly it ran as a story on The One Show, which I worked on with the One Show team, and we managed to put together, I think, a pretty effective short package which explained the issues and the Protection of Military Remains Act, and the moral issues of commemoration in primetime telly on a Monday evening on BBC One. It doesn't, that's in terms of actually communicating, that's probably a larger audience than a lot of archaeological programmes would normally get. The other story I wanted to highlight was the story earlier on this year about the... so I was watching the clock at the back, Lord, sorry. It is the story that appeared first of all in the Mail and then went viral across most of the right-wing press about trigger warnings at UCL on their conflict archaeology course. It was written by a man called James Denningpole, who is the UK editor of Breitbart. We've heard of Breitbart a lot recently. But it basically there was a sort of baton race to effectively traduce the conflicts archaeology course, saying that it was using trigger warnings and so on, when in fact, if you look at the course handbook and so on, which it was published online and they just didn't check because they didn't want to, because they wanted to make a wider point about snowflake university courses. They were the Mail and the other papers deliberately went out to misrepresent the evidence to make an issue where actually there wasn't one. What the course was actually saying was that if people think conflict archaeology is a very sensitive area, people who have worked in war zones, who've worked on war crimes, who've worked, maybe people who've been in the services or charities, NGOs who've got PTSD and so on, issues like flashback and so on is really important, and it's very important that you do exercise a duty of care when you're dealing with those issues. That was being traduced by what the Mail did, so we ran a story on it. The reason I'm mentioning it, and I'll finish here, there's a lot more I could say, maybe that's for another day and another longer session maybe, or a subject-specific session. But the main reason that, again, we ran a story on it was that the UCL Media Office did not defend their course and did not defend their course leader. They adopted the PR tactic of basically sitting back on their hands, hoping it would go away and not drawing attention to it. The fact that it was all over the press and had gone viral in the archaeological blog sphere didn't seem to matter to them. So we wanted to put the count aside. As I say, there's a lot more I could say. I'm aware of the pressure of time. If there's time in the discussion later, maybe there are other issues we could raise. But as I say, I just wanted to thank you for listening and say to you, if you've got stories like this, don't sit on them. There are people who can deal with them, not just me and Pipeline, although we say we follow the NUJ Code of Conduct, we protect our sources. There are ways and means of communicating securely and not drawing attention to people if we do pass information. But there are other organisations as well. You know, CBA has its campaigning arm as well, and I think increasingly there will be others, because as I say, just a final thought. It's something that I mentioned on the Twitter feed this morning. I think the situation in archaeology at the moment is so fragile and so potentially dangerous for the future of the subject we all care about, that I think we're all going to need to find new ways of communicating this stuff to people who aren't archaeological specialists, who are in government and in local government. And actually, if they're misbehaving, whoever they are, whether it's with a government body, a local government body, or an agency, or a commercial consultancy, or whoever, then they need to be held to account on behalf of the public who they're meant to be serving. Thank you.
thank you, Andy. You may have noticed that we've crossed into the session of the day, which is themed very broadly around advocacy. Now, I'm going to allow a question in a moment, but I wanted to ask you, Andy, you're sort of, the pipeline in particular, and I know you've got figures in different pies,
Yes.
but the pipeline in particular, it's a pressure news service. It's designed to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the full-length script, and I will publish the full-length script on academia.edu, so if any of you want to read the full unexpurgated version, it will be there in, probably after Christmas now, but it will be up there, and I'll tweet when it goes up. And that's aside whatever publication, I don't know what you're planning. But one of the things I was going to say later on is that I've been on a bit of a journey since I started doing this. I started off doing overt campaigning. I think now it's, in terms of the way certainly this has developed, and the Queen Mary story is a case in point, it's more effective to argue a case with evidence on an even-handed basis and give a right of reply to the person you're criticising. Because actually, when they don't reply to you, when you write that at the end of the article, so-and-so has been approached for comment up until the time of publication, they have declined to answer, that tells you a lot. So I think it has morphed into a more, perhaps a more traditional kind of format. But again, that's just on the basis of experience, I think it's more effective.
So I'm going to take Chair's privilege and say, while we've got you here, and I think you have a lot of impact, potential and actual, through that kind of avenue. What's your advice to people in this room, be they professionals, be they representatives of organisations like we are at the CBA, an organisation which has and does try to retain a sort of neutrality?
Yeah.
They don't want to be pointing fingers and saying, you know, so directly as you're able to do. So what's your advice to both the CBA and organisations like us and other professionals in the sector?
I think we're a partnership. Like in all, archaeology is a partnership between different disciplines, between different skills and skill sets and so on. I think, I mean, I have the advantage, I don't have an academic tenure, so I don't have to refer to the university press office. All I have to care about, and again it's something I was going to go into later, is the legal issues. Can I stand up, if somebody writes me a solicitor's letter, can we stand the story up in a way that makes us as legally as possible fireproof? And I've been very lucky to work with colleagues who have legal expertise in a lot of this. I think there will be stories that you'll be able to, you'll have a gut feeling that you'll be able to do, you can handle yourselves through a local advocacy system or a national body or whatever. There are some stories where there are vested interests, government interests and so on, where it's really helpful to be outside, and that's where the old-fashioned, I'm not a trained journalist. Any skills that I've got have been developed through doing this over the last 4 or 5 years. I know there are other people in the room who do have journalistic background, and they've actually given a lot of advice and help in this sort of thing. But there will be points that, sometimes there will be a story that you care about so much, but you can't deal with it, and that's when you can come to, say, us, Pipeline, me, whoever, and either write it yourself, and we can publish it under a private eye type, lunchtime OBU pseudonym, or if that's still too close, we can take on the material, distance it, protect the source, and still get it out there in the public domain. So, yeah.
I'm going to save questions now until the end because I don't want to get so off track and save that discussion slot for the end because it's now the end of the day. We definitely don't want to run over. So I'm going to invite Mike to come down and say thank you again to Andy. We'll definitely pick some of these things up again at the end of the discussion session.
Thank you.